The moment Cal Harper pulled the pin on the magnetic clamp, the hull of the alien patrol ship groaned like something alive. He did not wait for it to settle. He slammed the secondary anchor into the aft plating, locked his boots to the surface, and pulled himself forward against the vacuum drag that wanted to rip him sideways into the dark. 3 seconds. That was the window the commander had given him. Meetzer 3 seconds before the ship's proximity sensors cycled back online and flagged the anomaly on the hull. He used 2 of them just getting his breath. The third he used to cut. The cutting tool was not standard issue. Nothing Call carried was standard issue anymore. After the fall of Station Gray, after the evacuation that was not really an evacuation, after everything the Velthari had done to the colonies in the belt, Cal had stopped trusting standard issue anything. The tool hummed against the aft maintenance hatch, chewing through the seal like it was soft cheese, and the hatch popped inward with a sound like a held breath releasing. He was inside before the seal finished hissing. The interior of a Velthari patrol ship was not built for human bodies. That was the first thing they taught you in infiltration school, back when there still was an infiltration school. The corridors were tall and narrow, the ceilings arching overhead in that organic way the Velthari preferred, like the inside of a rib cage. The lighting was bioluminescent, soft blue-green pulsing from strips along the floor, and the air smelled like copper and something sweet Cal could never identify. Not unpleasant, just wrong in the way that everything Velthari was wrong. Designed for a species that thought sideways, moved sideways, and did not understand why humans kept dying on them. He moved fast and low, one hand on the wall, reading the vibrations. A Velthari ship this size carried a crew of 4. He had already accounted for 3 of them. The pilot was the problem. Velthari pilots did not leave their station during active patrol. That was doctrine for them, the same way breathing was doctrine for humans. The pilot was bonded to the ship's nervous system through a filament interface at the back of the skull, a thread of living tissue that ran from the pilot's brainstem into the ship's core processing array. It made them extraordinary navigators. It also made them extraordinarily difficult to extract from a moving vessel without killing them and the ship simultaneously. Cal needed this pilot alive. The mission briefing had been short because the colonel did not like long briefings. The Velthari had a pilot who had been present at the Gray Station event. Not a shooter, not a commander, a witness. Chose someone who had been in the navigation seat when the order came down and had watched the whole thing happen from inside the ship that carried out the strike. Someone who, if given the right incentive, might tell the human alliance exactly who gave the order and why. The diplomatic wing had been trying to get that information through channels for 8 months. The channels had produced nothing. Cal was the alternative to channels. He reached the navigation bay door and stopped. Through the door, he could hear something he had not expected. Music. Not human music. Velthari vocal harmonics were structured differently, built in layers that the human ear processed as slightly dissonant, almost uncomfortable. But this was something else. This was one voice, low and unhurried, the melody moving in a pattern that felt almost like a lullaby. Except the notes kept resolving somewhere unexpected, landing a half step off from where you anticipated them, which made the whole thing feel like standing on a floor that was slightly tilted. He had been told the pilot was female. He had been given a name he could not pronounce and a file photograph that showed a Velthari in the mid-range of their age spectrum, which meant nothing to him because Velthari aging was not linear. The file said she was considered young by her species standards. It also said she had a distinguished service record and 2 commendations for precision navigation under fire. It did not say, she sang to herself on patrol. Cal pressed his back to the wall beside the door and ran through his options. He had a sedation injector rated for Velthari physiology. He had a restraint kit. He had the extraction beacon that would bring the pickup shuttle in the moment he activated it. What he did not have was a guarantee that sedating a pilot mid-interface would not trigger a cascade alert through the ship's core systems that would lock every door, vent the atmosphere, wash and broadcast a distress signal to every Velthari vessel within range. He needed her out of the interface before he touched her. The only way to get a Velthari pilot out of the interface voluntarily was to make the ship do something the pilot's training required her to respond to physically. A manual override situation, a hull breach, a navigation conflict that demanded direct physical input at a secondary console. Cal looked at the cutting tool in his hand. He looked at the maintenance panel on the wall to his left. He thought about the 3 seconds he had used getting through the hatch, and how none of the decisions he had made since then had been the cautious ones, and how he was still alive, and how that was either evidence that the cautious decisions were overrated or evidence that his luck was running so hot it was about to burn out. He opened the maintenance panel, found the secondary guidance relay, and pulled it. The ship lurched, not violently. Velthari engineering did not do violent lurches, but with a deep, rolling shudder, like a large animal shifting its weight in sleep. The bioluminescent strips flickered from blue-green to amber. Somewhere in the navigation bay, the singing stopped. Then the door opened from the inside. She was taller than the file photograph had suggested. Most Velthari were in person. The photographs never captured the way they held themselves, the elongated posture, the way their secondary joints made their movement look like something between walking and flowing. Her coloring was the pale silver gray of deep space Velthari, the kind born on ships rather than planets, with the bioluminescent markings along her jaw and collarbones that pulsed very faintly in a rhythm Cal recognized after a moment as her heartbeat. Her eyes were amber, wide set, and currently fixed on him with an expression he could not read, but that his body interpreted as danger without waiting for his brain to weigh in. The filament interface trailed from the base of her skull, a thin thread of silver-white tissue that ran back through the open door and into the console behind her. She was out of the seat. She was not out of the interface, which meant she was exactly as stuck as he needed her to be. She said something in Velthari, fast and clipped, the tone of someone issuing an instruction they expected to be obeyed. Cal held up both hands, the cutting tool still in one of them, and said the one Velthari phrase he had memorized for this exact situation. It meant, "I am not here to cause harm. I am here to ask a question." The translation was imperfect. He knew that. The instructor who had taught it to him had said it came across roughly as, "I intend no injury. I have an inquiry." Anos, which in Velthari social syntax carried the specific implication of a formal request for information exchange rather than a demand or a threat. She stared at him for a long moment. The amber lights pulsed. The ship shuddered again, more softly, recalibrating around the missing relay. Then she said something else, shorter, and this time the tone was different. Not compliance, not agreement, but something that sounded, even through the alien architecture of the language, like curiosity. Cal took a breath. This was where the mission either worked or it did not. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the data chip, small, flat, carrying 8 months of evidence the diplomatic wing had gathered and not been able to use. The thing they needed her to look at. The thing that might, if the intelligence assessment was right, mean something to her that it could not mean to anyone who had not been in that navigation seat on that particular day. He held it out. She did not take it, but she did not move away from it either. And in the amber light of a ship, she could not fly and he could not pilot. With the vacuum of space 30 centimeters of hull away from both of them, that was enough to start. The first thing Kyle Morgan learned about Velthari pilots was that they did not blink the way humans did. They had a secondary membrane, translucent, that slid across the eyes sideways at intervals that did not match any rhythm KL could anticipate. It was not threatening, exactly. But it was the kind of thing that made the back of your brain send small, urgent signals to the front of your brain that the front of your brain had to keep overriding. Kale was Kyle's extraction backup. He had come in through the same hatch, 40 seconds behind, carrying the portable translation unit that Cal should have been carrying. Except Cal had left it on the shuttle because he had been in a hurry, and bad decisions made under time pressure were still bad decisions. He arrived in the corridor outside the navigation bay to find Cal and the Velthari pilot standing approximately 1 meter apart, neither of them moving. The data chip sitting on the floor between them where the pilot had apparently knocked it when Cal extended it toward her. Nikeo looked at the chip on the floor. He looked at Cal. Cal made a very small gesture with his eyes that meant, "Do not speak, do not move suddenly." And also, possibly, I know, just fix it." Kale crouched slowly, picked up the chip, and held it out toward the pilot with both hands in the open palm position that the cultural briefing had identified as universally non-threatening across 17 documented Velthari regional dialects. The pilot looked at his hands. She said something. The translation unit on Kyle's belt, which he had turned on when he entered the ship and which had been quietly processing ambient speech since then, rendered it in his earpiece as, "Your companion has poor manners for someone making a request." Kyle almost smiled. He had been told Velthari had no humor. He was increasingly convinced that whoever had written that report had simply not been listening correctly. He said, like in the stilted translation unit Velthari that always sounded like someone reading aloud from a phrase book. He is aware of this. He is working on it. The pilot looked at him for a moment with those amber eyes and the sideways blinking membrane. Then she reached out and took the chip. She did not look at it. She held it between 2 fingers, the way you might hold something you were not yet sure was safe to touch. And she said, "Why this ship? There are 30 Velthari vessels in this patrol sector. Why this one?" The translation unit rendered it clearly enough. Kale looked at Cal. Cal looked at the floor for a half-second in a way that meant he was deciding how much truth to use. Cal said, "Because you were there." The pilot went very still, not the stillness of someone freezing, not fear, not threat response. The stillness of someone for whom a word has just landed somewhere it was not expected to land. And who is waiting to find out what it means that it landed there. The filament interface at the back of her skull pulsed once, brighter than before. She said, "Gray Station." It was not a question. Cal said, "Gray Station." The amber lights in the corridor had stabilized. The ship was running on its backup navigation array now, which meant it was holding position but not actively patrolling, and which meant the other 3 crew members, wherever they were, would notice the change in the ship's behavior pattern within the next 12 minutes if nothing resolved. Kyle had been counting since the moment he came aboard. He said in English to Cal, 11 minutes. Cal nodded without looking at him. The pilot said something to the translation unit that came out as, "You want me to tell you what I saw?" Cal said, "Yes, Aunt," she said. "And if what I saw is something that would be dangerous for me to have seen." Cal said, "Then you would not be safe on a Velthari ship. which means the most dangerous thing in this corridor right now is the interface keeping you connected to a vessel crewed by people who might already know what you know and might already be deciding what to do about it. It was a long speech for Cal. Cale had worked with him for 3 years, and Cal preferred short. The fact that he had put that many words together in sequence meant he believed every one of them. The pilot looked at the filament interface trailing from her skull. She said, "Disconnecting mid-transit causes neural cascade damage. The recovery time is," Cal said. "Our medic is on the pickup shuttle. He has worked on Velthari pilots before. He knows the protocol." The pilot said, "There is no human medic who knows the Velthari neural interface protocol." Cal said, "Ours learned it specifically for this." Which was true. Lieutenant Dana Reeves had spent 4 months learning a medical procedure. She had a roughly 40% chance of ever needing to use, because Cal had said he might need it, and Dana had decided that was good enough for her. Kyle had always found that about Donna. She committed to things before she knew if they would matter, and they always ended up mattering. The pilot was quiet for a long moment. Kyle said, "9 minutes. And the pilot said, "If I come with you, if I tell you what I saw, what happens to me after?" Cal said, "That depends on what you saw and what you decide to do with it." She said, "That is not an answer." Cal said, "No, but it is an honest one. And I think you are tired of answers that are not honest." Something shifted in the amber light behind her eyes. Not softening. The Velthari did not soften in ways humans recognized. But something that had been held tight released, just slightly, on the way a fist uncurls not because it wants to, but because the arm holding it has finally gotten too tired. She said, "My name, in your language, is closest to the word for the specific quality of light that comes through deep water. There is no exact translation." Kyle said, "We will call you whatever you would like us to call you." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Sable. That was a word in one of your older languages that I encountered in a navigation database. It is close enough." And Cale said, "Sable." Sable looked at the filament interface one more time. She reached up with one hand and placed her fingers at the base of her skull where the thread of tissue emerged. She said, "This will take a moment." And then she began the process of disconnecting herself from the ship that she had been part of for 6 years. In a corridor of amber light, with 8 months of someone else's evidence in one hand and 7 minutes before the crew found them. Cale watched Cal watch her and thought that whatever happened next, they were already past the point where turning back was the same as being safe. The pickup shuttle was not comfortable. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be fast, low signature, and difficult to track on Velthari sensor arrays, which meant it was roughly the size of a walk-in closet with engines attached. And the engines were running hot because fast and low signature did not always get along with each other, and right now fast was winning the argument. Sable sat against the far wall with both knees drawn up, which was how Velthari sat when they were in small spaces. It was a posture the cultural briefing had flagged as neutral, not defensive, just compact. The filament interface site at the base of her skull was covered in a bio-seal patch, that lieutenant. Dana Reeves had applied with a focus that looked calm from the outside, but that Cale, who knew Dana, recognized as the particular intensity of someone performing a procedure they had practiced 400 times, but never done for real. The disconnection had been rough, not catastrophic. Dana had been ready. The protocol had held. But Sable had gone very pale and very still for approximately 90 seconds, during which the shuttle had been rocketing away from the patrol ship, and Cal had been sitting beside her with 2 fingers on her wrist, taking a pulse, because it was the only useful thing he could do, and Cal always needed to be doing something useful. She had come back to herself slowly, the way someone surfaces from deep water. Present, then more present, and then fully present and apparently annoyed about having been temporarily not present, which was, Kyle thought, probably a good sign. Now Dana was logging vitals, and Sable was watching her do it with the same expression she had worn when she took the data chip, guarded, not hostile. The wariness of someone who has not yet decided whether a thing is trustworthy, but is not willing to dismiss it either. Cal was at the front of the shuttle talking to the colonel via encrypted channel. Kyle could hear enough to know that the colonel was not thrilled about the relay Cal had pulled to get Sable out of the interface. Something about protocol and asset damage, and the fact that the Velthari crew of that patrol ship had now noticed the missing relay and the missing pilot, and were currently broadcasting a status alert that had lit up half the sector. Cal's side of the conversation was mostly, "Yes, sir." "Understood, sir." With one moment of, "The alternative was leaving her there, sir," which Cale thought covered it pretty well. Cale sat across from Sable and looked at the data chip she was still holding. He said, "You have not looked at it." She said, "I am aware of what is on it." He said, "How?" She said, "Because the people who sent you would have collected everything that was collectible. And I know what was collectible." Cale said, "Then you know what we need." She said, "You need me to confirm it. You need a witness. That you need someone who was in the room, in the ship, when the order came through. Because evidence can be dismissed. A witness who was there and who is willing to speak is something that cannot be as easily dismissed." Kyle said yes. She turned the chip over in her fingers. The bioluminescent markings along her jaw pulsed in a slow, even rhythm that Dana had told him, quietly, while taking the readings, was the Velthari equivalent of a resting heart rate. She was not panicking. She was thinking. She said, "The order came from the Navigation Council, not from a military commander. The Navigation Council does not have military authority under the Velthari Accord of 12 years ago. Which means the strike on Gray Station was not a military action. It was a political one, executed through a chain of command that had no legal standing to execute it." Kyle was very still. She said, "I filed a notation in my navigation log at the time, flagging the irregularity, noting that the order routing was inconsistent with standard protocol. Navigation logs are archived and are technically accessible under the Velthari Transparency Statute. But the statute requires a formal request, and a formal request requires knowledge that the log exists, which no Human Alliance representative would have had reason to know." Kyle said, "But you knew." She said, "I knew." He said, "And you kept the notation." She said, "I kept the notation." Kyle thought about 8 months of diplomatic channels producing nothing. He thought about the 4 months Dana had spent learning a medical procedure on the chance that it would matter. He thought about the moment Cal had pulled the secondary relay on a ship he had no business being inside, purely on the calculation that the alternative was worse. He said, "Why did you come with us?" Sable was quiet for a moment. She said, "Because I have been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Your companion asked it. He said, 'You were there.' Not, 'Tell us what happened.' Not, 'Give us the information.' He said, 'You were there,' which means he understood that being there was different from simply having data." She looked at the chip one more time. She said, "I was there. I watched it happen. I filed the notation. And for 12 months, I have flown patrol routes over the wreckage sector and looked at my navigation log and waited. Kale said, "For what?" She said, "For it to matter." The shuttle hit a turbulence pocket from the ion wake of a passing carrier, and the whole frame shuddered. Donna grabbed her equipment. Kyle grabbed the wall grip. Sable did not move. She sat perfectly still against the vibration with both knees drawn up and the data chip in her hand. And Kyle thought she had probably been perfectly still through worse things than turbulence. When Cal came back from the front of the shuttle and sat down and looked at Sable and said, "The Colonel wants to know if you are willing to make a formal statement." Sable said, "That is why I am on this shuttle." Cal said, "He also wants to know if you understand the personal risk." Sable said, "Do you ask all your witnesses that question? Or only the ones you think might not have thought it through?" Cal said, "All of them. Because sometimes they have not thought it through." Sable said, "I have thought it through." She said it simply, not bravely. Bravery was a performance word, Cal had told Kale once, and the people who actually had it never sounded like they were performing it. She said it the way someone states a thing that is simply true, because it is simply true, and there is nothing more that needs to be said about it. Cal looked at her for a moment. He said, "All right." And then the shuttle banked hard on the new heading, toward the Alliance waypoint, toward the Colonel, toward whatever happened next. And the amber light from the emergency strip along the ceiling caught the bioluminescent markings on Sable's jaw and made them glow faintly silver in the dark. Kale looked out the small rear viewport at the stars. 12 months. Gray Station. A navigation log with a notation that no one had known to look for. It was going to matter. The Alliance waypoint designated Holding Facility 7 was built into the underside of a decommissioned ore processing platform that someone had decided looked less like a military installation if it was covered in rust and old cargo containers. It did not look less like a military installation. It looked exactly like a military installation that someone had covered in rust and old cargo containers. But it was outside Velthari patrol jurisdiction by approximately 40 kilometers, which was the margin the Alliance legal team had decided was sufficient, and the Alliance legal team did not appreciate being second-guessed on margins. Cal did not like the facility. He had never liked it. He had been debriefed there twice before, and both times had come away with the specific feeling of having said true things in a room designed to make true things feel insufficient. But the Colonel was there, and the legal team was there, and now Sable was there, and so Cal was there. Sitting in a corridor outside the room where Sable had been for the past 3 hours, being interviewed by people who were very good at interviews. Dana had cleared her for the session after 2 hours of monitoring. The neural interface disconnection had gone cleaner than expected, which Dana attributed to the precision of the procedure, and Cal attributed to Sable being the kind of person who could will her own recovery out of stubbornness. He had not said this out loud, because Sable was not a person he knew well enough to say things like that about yet. But he thought it. Kale came down the corridor with 2 cups of something that smelled like coffee, but was definitely not coffee, and sat down next to Cal and held one out. Cal took it, looked at it, drank it anyway. Kale said, "The legal team seems pleased." Cal said, "The legal team is never pleased. They are sometimes less displeased." Kale said, "They are less displeased." Cal looked at the closed door. He said, "Is she all right?" Kale said, "Dana checked on her an hour ago. She said Sable asked for a window." Cal said, "A window?" Kale said she wanted to be able to see space while she talked. They moved her to the end room, the one with the porthole. Cal thought about a pilot who had been bonded to a ship's navigation system for 6 years, who could feel the drift of stars through a filament at the base of her skull. Not sitting in a room on a rust-covered ore platform, being asked to remember the worst thing she had ever navigated through. He thought about how much that cost and how she had decided it was worth paying, and how that decision had been made alone, in a narrow corridor, in amber light, while the clock ran down. He said, "Good." The door opened, and the lead legal attaché came out. Book, a woman named Opal Dunn, who had the permanent expression of someone running 47 simultaneous calculations and was mildly disappointed in everyone around her for only running 12. She looked at Cal and said, "She has requested to speak with you before the formal statement is logged." Cal said, "Me specifically." Dunn said, "You specifically." He stood up and went in. The end room had a porthole roughly 30 centimeters across, more useful as a psychological feature than an actual view. But Sable had positioned herself so she could see it from the chair she was in, and Cal could tell from the angle of her head that she had been looking at it for most of the 3 hours. She said, without turning, "The Navigation Council member who issued the order is named Varek 6 of the Long Tide. That is a name your translation systems will have difficulty with. The closest human equivalent is something like Varek Longcurrent, Nikau, which loses the generational significance of the original, but is close enough for legal documentation." Cal sat down in the chair across from her. He said, "Why are you telling me before the official record?" She said, "Because I want to tell a person before I tell a document. There is a difference, in the Velthari way of thinking, between knowledge that has been given to a living mind and knowledge that has been given to a record. Both matter, but one matters first." Cal said, "All right. Tell me." Sable turned from the porthole and looked at him. She said, "Varek Longcurrent ordered the strike on Gray Station because Station Gray was running a xenolinguistic research program. A human team had partially decoded a Velthari navigational dialect that had been classified for 200 years. Not a military dialect, a navigational one. The kind of information that, if fully decoded, would allow a human pilot to interpret Velthari star charts and use them. Cal said, "That is what they killed 700 people for." Sable said, "They killed 700 people because an information boundary was being dissolved, and the Navigation Council wanted the boundary to remain." Cal said, "And you were there?" Sable said, "I was the pilot who brought the ship into position. I calculated the approach vector. And then I watched, and I did nothing except file a notation in a log that I knew had a low probability of ever being found." Cal said nothing. I think Sable said, "I could have broken interface. It would have incapacitated the ship. It would also have killed me, in all likelihood, and possibly the crew, and would not have stopped the order from being executed through one of the other 3 vessels in the formation. But I could have done it." Cal said, "You didn't." She said, "I didn't." The porthole framed a thin slice of stars behind her. The bioluminescent markings along her jaw were very still. Cal said, "You have been carrying that for 12 months. She said yes. He said, "And now you are making a formal statement that will name Varek Longcurrent and the Navigation Council and put you in a position where returning to Velthari space is not an option." She said, "Yes." He said, "Because it matters." She said, "Because it matters." Cal looked at the porthole, at the stars behind her, at the filament site on the back of her skull, sealed and healing. Henri said, "Then let us go tell the document." Sable stood. She was taller than him, which he was used to by now, and she moved to the door and paused. She said, "At Gray Station. Were there children?" Cal said, "Yes." She closed her eyes once, the secondary membrane sliding sideways. She said, "I wanted to know." He did not ask her why she wanted to know. Some things you want to know not because the knowing changes what you will do, but because the not knowing is its own kind of dishonesty. And some people will not allow themselves that particular comfort. He held the door open for her. They walked back down the corridor together, toward the room where Opal Dunn and the legal team and the recording equipment were waiting. And the stars continued doing what stars do, which is burn in the dark, regardless of what the small, warm things orbiting them decide to do about each other. The formal statement took 4 hours. Cal was not in the room for it, and he sat in the corridor with Cale and Dana and the Not Coffee and listened to the facility make its particular sounds. The ventilation cycling, the distant thrum of the ore platform's structural stabilizers, the occasional clipped exchange of a corridor being navigated by someone in a hurry. At one point, Dana said, "She is going to need somewhere to go after this." A Velthari national who has formally testified against the Navigation Council cannot go back. She cannot go to a Velthari colony station. She cannot go anywhere that the Council has influence, and the Council has influence in a lot of places. Cal said, "I know." Dana said, "Do you have a plan for that?" Cal said, "I have the beginning of a plan." Cale said, "The beginning of a plan from Cal is usually what other people call a complete plan, and then things happen to it." Cal said, "Things always happen to it." The door opened a little after hour 4, and Opal Dunn came out and said, "To no one in particular, but definitely to Cal. The statement is complete, logged, and already transmitted to the Alliance Tribunal Secretariat. 3 copies, separate servers. A 4th physical copy is in the safe in my office," Cal said. And Dunn said, "And the Navigation Council is going to have an extremely uncomfortable several weeks." Cal said, "Good." Dunn said, "The witness is asking for you again." Cal went in. Sable was standing at the porthole, and the room was quieter without the legal team in it. The recording equipment was dark. She was looking at the stars, and she did not turn when he came in. But she said, "It is done." He said, "It is done." She said, "Do you know what a Velthari pilot says when they complete a navigation sequence? When they have brought the ship through safely and the destination is confirmed?" Cal said, "No." She said, "We say, the stars are where we left them. It is a way of acknowledging that arrival is not certain, that every journey has the possibility of arriving somewhere the stars have moved. When they are where we left them, it means the journey was true." She turned from the porthole. She said, "The stars are where I left them." Cal looked at her for a moment. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "I need to know what comes next." Cal said, "There will be a protective placement, a facility with a view of space. I will make sure of that. There will be security. There will be probably a period of time where everything is uncertain and slow and feels like waiting. And then the tribunal will begin, and it will not be fast, and it will not be easy. And at some point they will need you to speak again." She said, "And you?" He said, "I will be doing other things, other corridors, other ships." She said, "But if I need the person who asked the right question?" Cal said, "You can find me." She nodded once. Then she said, "Cal Harper, that is your full name?" He said, "Yes." She said, "In the Velthari naming tradition, a name given back is a name remembered. I am giving your name back to you. It will be remembered." Cal had been given a lot of things in a lot of corridors on a lot of operations, and most of them were things that could be carried in a pocket or filed in a report. He did not know what to do with this one, which was unusual for him because he generally knew what to do with things. He said, "Thank you, Sable." She said, "Go. Do your other corridors." He went. Kyle was waiting in the outer corridor. Cal picked up his gear and they walked toward the docking bay. And Cal did not look back, because he had learned a long time ago that looking back at things you have done, when they have gone as well as things can go, is a way of undoing the going. In the docking bay, the shuttle was fueled, and Dana was already running pre-flight checks, and the engines were building to the low whine that meant departure was close. Kyle said, "Where to?" And Cal said, "The Colonel has a list." Kale said, "The Colonel always has a list." Cal said, "Yes." They boarded, the hatch sealed. The engines pushed them out of the docking bay and into the space between the platform and the stars. And Cal looked at the navigation display for a moment, and then at the viewport, and then at nothing in particular. Somewhere behind them on the ore platform, in a room with a porthole, a former Velthari pilot was looking at the stars she had navigated by for 6 years and deciding what the rest of her life would look like when it was not built around a ship's core processing array. Somewhere in Velthari political space, a navigation council member named Varek Longcurrent was about to find out that the notation in a pilot's log had been found. The shuttle banked onto its new heading. The stars were where they had been left. Cal pulled up the Colonel's list and started reading.